This is a time of change in the land that would eventually be called Minnesota. Over the course of the 1830s and 40s and into the 1850s, Minnesota is in a state of transition from collectivism, from a hybrid society that is made up of immigrants, business people, soldiers, and indigenous people, to a land of missionaries, settlers uninterested in living alongside indigenous people, and most effectively, most importantly, we're changing to a land of private property. And the state, the territory, is being slowly and systematically carved up, divided up, to later be handed out and sold. I'm Sam Temple. This is the podcast where we break down the book North Country by Mary Lethert Wingerd. And today we're talking about Chapter 5, Highway to the North. With me is Logan Ledman. Logan, how are you?
I'm good, Sam. I'm excited to jump into this chapter. This chapter is definitely a break from how the book has been so far. We're really fully in this new world now, the world that has slowly been evolving in the first 4 chapters, that is finally here now in Chapter 5, which is the new young American culture asserting itself in its first real ways. Now that Fort Snelling's been built, now that the fur trade is falling apart, and now, most importantly, that the transportation equipment and technology has developed to the point where this faraway land of Minnesota is more accessible than ever. The steamboat has entered the scene, Sam.
That's right. They took steamboats to get here. The settlers and tourists, that is. That's a bit of a reference that no one gets, but we will keep that inside joke there. But Logan, we're not here to talk about inside jokes. In fact, Logan, I'm here to give you some sizzle for what's going to come later in the episode, because today it's all of the newfound history buff's dream come true. Today on 1855, we are talking about Hamilton.
That's
yep.
right.
So
make sure you guys stick around.
Yeah, stick around for the end. At the end of this episode, you got to listen all the way through, because it's set up perfectly. It's this interweaving narrative, but by the end, I promise you there will be some spectacular payoff for when we talk about how Hamilton, and specifically everyone's favorite sister, okay, she's not the favorite, everyone's second favorite sister, Eliza Schuyler, comes in and just ties this whole chapter together. So you Hamel heads out there, stay tuned.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about steamboats, Sam.
Let's talk a little bit about steamboats. So, like you said, Logan, basically prior to 1823, if you were in Minnesota, you were either native to Minnesota, you were born to Minnesota as a Métis or part Dakota, part European ancestry, or you were there seeking business, whether that was in the form of being a soldier or you were selling to soldiers at the new Fort Snelling. If you were there for business, ambition, or because you were born there. There weren't a lot of people who basically weren't interested in a lot of very strenuous, difficult work. If you weren't interested in getting something out of it, there was very little reason to come to Minnesota. But in 1823, the first steamboat comes through and changes everything. That makes it accessible to people coming from the south. There was an easy way to get to the Mississippi from the east and make your way up. But it really, really changed things. And one of the most important people that made their way to Minnesota at this time, it was around 1835, a fellow by the name of Joseph Nicollet made his way here. Logan,
That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit about Nicollet?
Yeah, any listeners will probably be familiar with the name Nicollet County, right?
Mm-hmm. And there's like a mall, I think.
Yeah, the Nicollet Mall. It's one of these names. There's been a lot of them so far on the podcast. that you've probably driven by a lot or seen on signs and not really given a second thought. But Nicollet is one of those guys who had an impact on the early.
Well, you give it a second thought when you drive past it, when you're a half mile past it, and you realize you missed your.
All right.
All right. You get what I was going for there. You get the joke I was going for.
That's great. Yeah. No, that's a good point.
That's the only instance where you give it a second thought, is what I'm saying.
Exactly. But Nicollet was an astronomer and cartographer, a guy who made maps and looked at the stars and stuff.
What a loser.
Yeah. Very much resembling a lot of the earlier folks we talked about on the podcast, the French explorers who came up here and mapped out the territory in the 16 and 1700s. But he's showing up in the 1830s when most of that work has already been done. But
so he's an extra loser.
He's no, I wouldn't. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say that. He does some geological studies that are important. The topographical maps that no one's done before.
No, guys. I'm going to the middle of nowhere that has already been explored. But wait. I'm not drawing maps. I know the stars might be a little dull for you guys. So you know what I'm going to do? You're going to laugh. You're going to laugh at yourselves because this is cool. I am going to look at the dirt and
the rocks.
And the rocks. And you guys are going to look like idiots.
Well, it ends up being very important because when you have someone looking at the rocks and looking at the soil and determining the value, essentially, of the land, as Wingerd writes, it marked the beginning of the commodification of land into real estate, which she calls the necessary first step to enable a shift to private property and settlement. And she also points out Pierre Shuteau, yes, who has been in this story.
Sacré Shuteau.
Okay, all right, buddy. Who has from the beginning.
I think that's the biggest laugh you got out of me.
Yeah.
Okay, buddy.
Okay, buddy. All right.
I'll cool it. All right.
No. Keep it up. Yeah. Shuteau, listeners will be familiar with him, hopefully as a result of his close connections to the fur trade.
And the puns I was trying to make last week. See, this is all just a ploy to get this to stick in your head.
That's right. So hopefully you guys remember that. He was the Sibley's boss, Henry Sibley's boss, essentially. This guy, Pierre Shuteau, provided financial support for Nicollet's expeditions. So it's the fur traders, as Wingerd writes, can read the trend of the future. And they can see that all this land, it's going to be theirs for the taking soon enough. And with the fur trade collapsing, money is not going to be in furs. It's not going to be in materials and goods anymore. The money to be made in Minnesota is going to be land. But Nicollet's not the only kind of guy who's showing up. Sam, talk to us about some of these travelers who are coming through.
Yeah, so a lot of people are coming up basically as tourists. They're coming up to see the land, see the business opportunities. A lot of people actually come up looking at the prospect of making a mill. So you're coming up on these big, powerful rivers that you're taking the steamboat up to see. You're seeing the confluence. You're seeing this settlement cropping up around Fort Snelling. You see a lot of people were actually drawn by the indigenous people, but not for the reasons that might be, okay, we want to experience different cultures, we want to meet these different people. No, I'm quoting Wingerd here. They're talking about one individual who opened a gallery with, quote, paintings and Indian artifacts. He toured the country to share his art and self-proclaimed expertise on Native culture and wrote glowingly about the beauty of the land, Minnesota, and the soon-to-be-vanished Indian. All this added to the growing interest in the North Country and pressure to open the gates to settlement, end quote. So it's become a bit of a tourist trap once it becomes accessible. So a lot of bigwigs are coming through. A lot of bigwigs are coming and seeing the opportunity that comes by. I quote Wingerd again. Quote, scarcely a week passed without visitors to Fort Snelling, the northern terminus of the tour. By the late 1830s, the fashionable tour had become so popular that excursion boats devoted solely to passengers equipped with commodious staterooms, washstands, and other amenities were a fairly common sight on the river, end quote. So nowadays, your river cruise, you go out for a few hours, you have a few drinks, and then you take a cab home. But there, this is your luxury line. This is your I can't think of a single cruise line.
I don't know.
Other than
it's not
Disney
a good time for cruises.
Yeah, Disney cruise, but
Sure.
that's not quite. I don't think they had any mascotted animals on the.
Well, actually, I wanted to dive into a point that you mentioned very briefly, actually, which is this way that
Paul Bunyan. Someone dressed up.
No.
Oh, a different thing that I mentioned.
Yeah,
okay, sorry.
yeah. The ways that indigenous people in Minnesota were advertised as these props to come and see in Minnesota. With this, and I wanted this idea, as it says, see the red man as he actually lived, and the idea that Indians are dying out. Like this was just this. It was accepted as fact in the 1830s that the people living in Minnesota were going to vanish, just because there was. It was just what had to happen. This civilization, this American civilization, had to be there. It had to exist, and it had to take over. And the consequence of that was that the Indians had to vanish. And that wasn't a statement of like, at this point, it's not necessarily it's not a violent fantasy explicitly right now. But it's just this sense that, well, they're going to go away because what else is going to happen? They can't stay, and we have to be there.
It's our destiny.
It's our destiny. Yeah. And so, but one of the effects of that sense of they're all going to be gone is come and see them while they're here. And that is a draw for the tourists as they come up. Something really fascinating that we don't. It kind of surprised me when I heard about it the first time, but it does make sense. That was part of the draw.
Yeah, the elites in the United States at the time had basically made the determination that the native people were going to be wiped out. So the discussion was not whether or not they are no longer on their land. The question was whether it will be done peacefully. The question is, well, will it be war? Will we just convert them to our way of life? Will we give them a little plot of land somewhere else? It was never a question of if, it was a matter of how. And it was going to happen as soon as possible. But let's talk a little bit more about the elite. I'm at the bottom of page 105, and I quote, "The local aristocracy was a bit rough around the edges, but no less attuned to the niceties of polite society and their esteemed visitors. Travelers who crossed the St. Peter River to call at the, quote, fine stone house of American Fur's chief agent, Henry Hastings Sibley, were impressed not only by Sibley's gracious manner and aristocratic bearing, but also by his book-lined study and the general air of civilization that he managed to create at his wilderness post. The fact that at least a few Dakotas were almost always camped nearby only highlighted the contrast between the savages and the charming Squire of Mendota, as Sibley was only half in jest coming to be known. The fort's most distinguished guests, Featherstone Hach, whose name I can't pronounce and we will not talk about again, Caitlin and Nicollet, for example, all gravitated to Sibley's hospitality. Nicollet spent the entire winter of 1837 as Sibley's guest. The two men whiled away long winter evenings discussing their shared interests and became fast friends. Sibley described Nicollet as a kindred spirit and helped the scientist secure backing from the fur company financiers for his future expeditions. The following year, Nicollet wrote to Sibley, his, quote, dear friend, that, quote, my heart beats with joy at the prospect of boxing and singing with you again, end quote. You know, hang out with the friends, open a couple cold drinks, and do some karaoke and some light barehanded boxing. Which is not, to be clear, using the hands of bears as boxing gloves.
Which it might have been in the 1830s. You're right.
It might have been in the 1830s, but I think the bare hand was actually in vogue. And actually, Sibley kind of looks like that classic picture of the strong man with the mustache who's
Yeah,
like
he
holding up the fisticuffs. Sibley kind of looks like that.
No,
So,
Sibley looks like a boxer. Yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
that I don't recollect what Nicollet looks like, but I
Yeah.
I can imagine these two elites coming up to Minnesota to feel kind of rough around the edges and living pretty rough while they're up here and
yeah.
just punching
Yeah.
each other in the face to pass the time.
Yeah. Yeah. But, I'm just going to say this once, and we've gotten some great support from the Minnesota Historical Society over the years, but they're hiring these reenactors to be at their historic sites, and they don't have a boxing ring set up. They don't have two people just punching each other for hours and hours at a time to get kids. Do it for the kids, guys.
It's a
Get
misstep.
them interested in history. I mean, I think it's a huge missed opportunity to really engage people in a different way, especially at a young age. There's something for the dads to do. There's something, there's just...
Oh, you're thinking it could be interactive. You're thinking dads from Lakeville and can come up to the Fort Snelling and pay $5 to box Henry Sibley.
Yeah, you gotta grow a mustache, and then there's an animatronic Sibley that has bare hands, and he just whacks you. He just whacks you.
Are we allowed to hit him?
Oh yeah, good luck.
Okay.
But
well, I think I might spend some time there then.
Yeah. No, he's got a great rope-a-dope. So
okay, well,
that's a boxing thing, I think.
I think it is. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk?
It's like the Hall of Presidents, but you can punch people.
All right, and that's what people's primary criticism of Disney is that there's not enough person-on-person violence. Yeah,
it gets aggressive. Aggressive. You can exchange words with Lincoln, but you never get to see the log splitter come out.
That's right.
Rail splitter, I think it was.
Yeah.
Anyway,
do you want to talk a little bit about some of the one of the more big wigs that came by, very big wigs?
Yeah. No, Logan.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay,
I know what you're talking about, but we're gonna get there. This is too much violence. We need to move more peacefully. We need to move to peacefulness and
towards
civility.
the light of God.
The light of God. That's exactly what I'm going for. Do you know anybody who could help me out with that?
I have a couple good suggestions actually. Maybe you could talk to my good friend. Who do we want to start with here?
Well,
because there's actually a lot. Believe it or not, while we're here in the 1830s, Sam, recently there's been a lot of good options for that.
Yes, true.
A lot of people have been stopping by. Maybe Stephenriggs you'd like.
Stephenriggs, yeah, that sounds great. I've heard a lot about him. I know Agent Toler. Lawrence Toler, we talked about last week. He's not he's the Indian agent at Fort Snelling, but he's a big fan too. He's been looking for the light of God. Do you want me to tell you why? Want me to tell you why?
Okay. Go for it.
This is a transition within a transition.
That's right.
But eventually we'll get where we're going. Yeah. All right. Quote. When missionaries arrived at Fort Snelling, they found an enthusiastic ally in Agent Toler, who was determined to persuade the Dakotas to take up farming as their primary occupation. Toler believed that an agricultural lifestyle would address several pressing issues that threatened Dakota survival. Game was becoming increasingly scarce, and several severe winters in the 1820s had caused severe hardship. They used several severe and then severe again, all in the same sentence, and that was just a little difficult. Okay. Yeah. They caused severe hardship among the tribes. Without adequate resources to alleviate their suffering, Toler had, quote, been compelled to be the witness of scenes the most unpleasant, end quote. Necessity then drove the Dakotas into the game-rich buffer zone, causing an upsurge in confrontations with equally stressed Ojibways. Farming, Toler asserted, would provide a more reliable food source and promote peace between the tribes. It would also break the Indians' relationship with the traders, who the agent was convinced were a pernicious influence, plying the Indians with contraband whiskey to keep them dependent on hunting for market. Most important, farming, in the style of white settlers, of course, I added the of course, would, quote, conduct his charges along the road to civilization, end quote. He would teach them the value of hard work, sobriety, enterprise, wean them from their improvident lifestyle, and eventually replace their collectivist worldview with an appreciation for the superiority of economic individualism and private property. Neither Toler nor the missionaries who worked to transform the Indians' way of life questioned their deeply held assumption that the only, quote, civilized man must look exactly like themselves, end quote. So that's just a good summary of where Toler is coming at, and also the draw of a lot of the priests and missionaries coming to the North Country at this time.
I want to bring Stephenriggs back into it here.
Yes. You mentioned this guy.
Yeah, is he? Because I think I've thought a little bit more about him, and he might not be the guy for you.
No.
So we'll talk about a couple of men like Stephen, who are Protestant. Not that that's the problem.
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir. Temples have been Baptist, temples have been Lutherans. I don't know what you're implying about us Protestants.
Okay.
But, okay, you were saying?
There's, in the early 1800s, the Second Great Awakening has inspired a fervent brand of evangelical Protestantism that is sweeping across the nation, and it inspires men like Stephenriggs to head deep into the Minnesota frontier.
See, that's probably what made the temples Baptists. So.
and try and spread spread the good word. And for him, the good word is, quote, "As tribes and nations, the Indians must perish and live only as men. With this impression of the tendency of God's purposes as they are being developed year after year, I would labor to prepare them to fall in with Christian civilization that is destined to cover the earth," end quote. So in this way, this kind of Second Great Awakening spirit couples very neatly.
I misheard that as Second Grade Awakening.
No.
The Second Great.
Second Great Awakening, yeah. So this
Second Great Awakening is when you learn about dinosaurs.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But this one is couples very neatly with the economic changes and the economic forces that are sweeping through Minnesota as well that we talked about. So there's this idea that industry has to push forward into Minnesota. The recognition of private property has to be instilled in the land, and there's also just there's a convenient additional spiritual aspect to this, in that there are people who do genuinely, just as a result of their personal religious beliefs and affiliations, that Christianity has its own destiny to be spread, and its own necessity to be spread across the earth, and that ends up dovetailing with the needs of the United States government, and so they work together pretty explicitly.
Yeah, no, the idea of manifest destiny being partnered with this evangelism is a really strong push to the West, and a really strong push for a lot of people in their personal lives as well. But it is important. Most of the evangelicals of the time, or evangelists, I should say, were coming out explicitly to change indigenous society, because they thought again, we talk about, it's not a question of whether the Indians are going to be gone, it's how. And if you are someone who is attempting to be more civil, maybe isn't a huge fan of warfare, doesn't really want a people to go extinct, but you think the only way that they should be around is, you might genuinely believe that Christianity is their only option at survival. There were a couple people who experienced a calling from the Congregational Church, and they decided to move west. There were these two young men by the name of Samuel and Gideon Pond, and they were in their early 20s, and they came out to Minnesota and actually set up camp and lived for a long time with the Dakota. And their experience with them, they lived alongside them, they learned their customs, they learned quite a bit of their language. Their experience with them really changed. It was contrary to a lot of the perception of the Dakota at the time, especially from a missionary perspective. A lot of missionaries weren't actually living alongside the Dakota. So I quote Samuel Pond, quote, "Romantic and sentimental writers may amuse themselves and may deceive the simple by such fabulous descriptions of the Indian character. But the real Dakota never sat for the picture and would not be flattered by it." Samuel Gideon Pond, who spent 20 years among the Dakotas, instead saw the Indians as whole human beings, quote, "men like other men, with the same diversity among them as among white people," end quote. So basically, rather than being these lazy savages, they're not lazy, they're not inferior, but they're also not the stereotype of this noble chief who was also coming into vogue, especially later in the century. They were people, and individuals like Samuel and Gideon Pond were few and far between at the time, but it is important to know, again, as we are creating this picture of Minnesota in the 1830s and 40s, there were people like the Ponds who recognized that the Dakota and Ojibwe and the indigenous people of Minnesota were people, just like everyone else. They recognized the basic humanity, even if their way of life was different. They found a respect for that. But their job was still to, and their mission was to evangelize, and they certainly did that as well, and that contributes to the degradation, the dissolution of a lot of Dakota society as it was known prior to white settlement.
Yeah, worth mentioning though, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that Wingerd writes, the Ponds, despite their efforts, they achieve few lasting conversions. And that's a theme here, as we'll talk about it maybe a little bit more later. It's not really a fruitful pursuit. There's not, at this point, for sure, in the 1830s and 40s, they're not overly successful at changing Dakota society from its own cultural roots to Christianity, but they do try. They do try very hard. Let me think here. What else? Let's talk a little bit about a man on a similar path as the Ponds in terms of not being representative of the sort of the Stephenriggs method.
Yeah,
of
an outlier. An outlier of the time. So let me quote Samuel Pond again.
Okay, yeah.
He's talking about a guy named Joseph Renville, and that's probably familiar name there. So we're quoting Samuel Pond. Quote, "Mr. Renville was certainly a man of superior natural abilities, and he had many admirers, but the most prominent traits of his character were such as belonged rather to a Dakota than to a white man." End quote.
Great.
So who is this Mr. Renville guy, Logan?
Yeah, we talked about him last week a little bit. He's a mixed ancestry interpreter, or he's a mixed ancestry man living on the at the Lac Qui Parle mission, 200 miles west of Fort Snelling, and he's played an important role in the territory since Zebulon Pike showed up in 1805. And he was an interpreter at that meeting. He's been an interpreter at important meetings and councils in the 30 years since. And in the meantime, Wingerd writes a great description of him. By backcountry standards, she writes, Renville was a wealthy man. 200 miles west of Fort Snelling, he had established a virtual fiefdom at Lac Qui Parle. Protected by a personal militia of young braves, Fort Renville, as the post was commonly known, was far more than a typical trader's station. Renville grazed 100 cattle, more than 24 horses, and a substantial flock of sheep. He had also begun to engage in small-scale agriculture. But unlike other enterprising traders, Renville shared the wealth with an open hand. He gave goods on credit to any hunter who asked, regardless of past performance or previous debts. He generously shared provisions and food with everyone in the band, holding nothing back, and was known widely for his hospitality to visitors. We talked, end quote. We talked about how honor and status is grown in the Upper Plains, Minnesota area, especially Dakota societies in one of our early episodes. And this idea of generosity and community obligation and kinship obligations was really fundamental to Dakota society. And Renville associated with that. Renville, she writes, accrued power by giving away material possessions rather than through personal accumulation, end quote. And he used it to his advantage. He engaged with the Dakota people on their grounds of how you're supposed to gain respect among each other. And the idea among the Dakota was, if somebody needs something from you, you give it to them. And your status isn't determined by the amount of material possessions you have, but the amount of material possessions you give away. As Wingerd writes, Lac qui Parle may have been one of the last bastions where customs of reciprocity between traders and Indians endured. So Renville, along with Samuel and Gideon Pond, are a couple examples of how, even in this changing time, there are still foundations of respect in different places, increasingly rare, but there are still people who are willing to engage with the Dakota and Ojibwe on a mutual level of respect.
Yeah. So basically, what had been created was this microcosm of that hybrid society.
Yeah.
That's what Fort Renville was. So in the 1830s and 1840s, we're seeing this shift from this hybrid society to the more traditional, more expected white settler frontier society. That's becoming more of the norm as the hybrid society is slowly starting to be choked out, essentially. We're seeing this shift from collectivism to private property. We're seeing this shift from more traditional and the hybrid spiritual understanding to Protestantism. But let's talk a little bit more about what that spiritual piece was like before. We've talked about what the traditional Dakota society was like, but within that hybrid society, there was also quite a bit of Catholicism. Yeah. And that was by virtue of, again, the initial settlement was French. So the initial religion that was introduced, when the French were briefly trying to convert the Dakota to a French way of life, before giving up and just letting them do what they wanted, they did try to instill some level of Catholicism, which was the common faith among the French. So I quote Wingerd on page 116. Quote, "The Catholicism of the North Country was a unique frontier version of the faith, one that blended native and Christian spirituality into a compatible hybrid. The very elements of Catholicism that Protestants found so unsettling, mysterious ritual, veneration of relics, the pantheon of saints, gave it a certain legitimacy in the eyes of native people, who could identify parallels with their own religious systems. The emphasis of community over individual, and the fictive kinships kinships created through godfathers and godmothers reinforced rather than challenged a worldview where kinship was the ordering principle. Moreover, the Jesuits had consciously shaped their teaching of the faith to conform to native understandings of spirituality. In the 18th century, that was all I need to quote there. End quote. But basically, that was it. There was this initial piece of society that the French were able to get the Dakotas to identify and embrace, to a certain extent, Catholicism. And that was because they were able to pair it and adapt it to the way of life that the Dakota were already using. And so for the missionaries in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, a lot of them mostly failed to do that. And so the efficacy is kind of down, like you said, with the pawns. It wasn't a great strategy to basically tell people you need to completely change your life. Rather than this way of life already fits with your beliefs. And there was, in another sense, this coexistence, this hybridization of French Canadian society with Native society, and that is increasingly rare with the Protestants coming from the West.
Yeah, I want to bring in one sentence from the bottom of that page too, that just to toss in one more thing. so the kind of hybrid Catholicism that is living amongst the Indians in the 1830s and 40s by the time these Protestant missionaries are showing up. It's been 100 years. She writes, more than 100 years since priests kept up any kind of regular appearance in the Minnesota area with the falling apart of the French Empire. But there are still communities of Catholic Dakota and Ojibwe people in Minnesota, and Wingerd says, largely due to Indian and Métis or mixed-race women who kept the faith alive and acted as its chief interpreters. The Catholicism they practiced became an integral part of the cultural fabric that knit traders, Indians, and Métis into a coherent society. So there's this community of women in the Dakota and Ojibwe societies who are keeping this hybrid faith that means something to them, to this world that's formed out of the combination of the cultures. They keep it alive, and they do the work of keeping it a part of that culture even after the original Catholic priests are gone, and they're not doing it anymore. They're not actively trying to convince anyone. These people take it on for themselves and form it and develop it in their own ways and keep it alive because they want to.
That's right.
Something really interesting to think about.
Yeah. So it wasn't until the 1840s that Catholicism was given another boost, actually, from the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Because around this time, the Great Awakening was not great for Catholics. And so they were just struggling to keep up their to support the Catholics that already existed. Beyond trying to convert people, they were just struggling to retain and support the Catholic dioceses and churches and followers that were already in existence. So in the 1840s, Augustin Ravoux, a reverend for the Catholic Church, came to the Minnesota area and was boosted by the French Canadians and mixed race folks who already believed in Catholicism in the Minnesota area. But he would spread rather thin, as were, like we said, a lot of Catholic clergy at this time. Quote, because he usually stayed no more than a month or two in a single locale, he made no attempt to introduce agriculture or other changes to the Indian way of life. Proficient in Dakota, he created a catechism and translated simple prayers and hymns, but relied primarily on homily preaching rather than biblical translations as the backbone of his teaching. Alone and with few resources, he depended on the hospitality of the Indians, living among them and sharing their way of life. As might be expected, he encountered less resistance than did his Protestant contemporaries, end quote. So again, that's much more effective. And particularly one of the folks that was very close to him and was known to be a close friend was Jean-Baptiste Faribault, who, will remind you, is a neighbor to one Henry Hastings Sibley, and also a good friend of Henry Hastings Sibley and a lot of the movers and shakers in the Minnesota community. So that is one way that Catholicism was able to keep alive, and especially to keep alive among the Dakota. And so we're in this state of this transition on the North Country. This transition, like we said, is still in effect. But what we've highlighted today is basically these strongholds, these remaining tenets, these holdovers from a world that is slowly fading from the map, is slowly fading from people's memory, and trying to compete, trying to coexist, trying to stay alive with this new settlement, this new frontier mentality, this new predominantly white, predominantly Protestant, predominantly Yankee way of living. And that's sort of the struggle that we will continue to see in the coming chapters. But wait! We're not done.
We're not done.
We're not done.
Okay.
Logan.
What?
What what are we missing? We need to talk about something else. I feel like there was something that was set up earlier. There's some sizzle. There's some sizzle on my tongue. There's some sizzle on my lips. That's still there.
I feel it too. I taste it. It's bubbling. It's bubbling around in my gums.
Yeah, Logan, we need to talk about Hamilton.
Okay. Let's do it. How could there possibly be a connection between Hamilton
could there possibly
and what we've been talking about so far? Explain.
How could there possibly be a connection? Well, let me tell you something.
It can't possibly be on page 105 of Mayor Wingerd's book North Country, can it?
Dun 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 dun. No. That was the Hamilton song. In case my wonderful acapella didn't translate there. So we're back at 105. We're back at the beginning, and I don't know what that was. And we talk about all these hoity-toity guests that come through. We talk about all these people who are coming up and just they're seeing the land, they're seeing the frontier on these steamboats, and they're having a good time. They're hanging with the aristocracy. They're maybe going out getting some sweet. I guess not pictures, but some sweet sketches of them, or writing in their diaries, writing back home, experiencing this crazy frontier society. And among them, nestled in this story, nestled in North Country, in this Minnesota history book, is the sequel, the hidden, secret sequel to the hit musical Hamilton. And word on the street is Lin-Manuel Miranda is actually working on this right now. So you get a sneak peek of what the plot for Hamilton 2, Back in the Habit, is going to be. I quote Mary Lethert Wingerd, collaborator of Lin-Manuel Miranda, on page 105. Quote, when Alexander Hamilton's 80-year-old widow, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, made a tour in 1837 from the steamboat coming up the Mississippi, Fort Society gave her a royal reception. Quote, a carpet had been spread, an armchair ready to receive her, the troops were under arms, and a fine band played as the lady and her party passed between two double rows of soldiers. End quote. Boom, Logan, we talked about Hamilton. I can put it in the thumbnail to get people to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it'll work.
Yeah. Will we talk about Hamilton again next week, or just go back to regular Minnesota history where I attempt to make jokes while we transition from piece to piece? I don't know. See you next week on... I'm trying to think of a Hamilton reference that we could end it on. Don't throw away your shot.
All right.
Tune in next week.
All right.